So welcome everyone. Happy New Year. My name is Roger Berkowitz, founder and rector here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be back in 2022, day after January 6th. It was an interesting conversation we had yesterday at online. So if anyone wants to check it out, it'll be up soon, I think, from the TSL people in Hudson. Good to be with you. This is the Hannah Arendt virtual reading group. And we are incredibly, after a long period, reaching the finish line here for the book, The Life of the Mind by Hannah Arendt. We're in the last section of volume 2. So remember, this book was imagined as 3 volumes, Thinking, Willing, and Judging. Hannah Arendt wrote 2 of them, Thinking and Willing, never published them. But they've been published posthumously, and that's what we're reading. We have read the entire volume 1 on thinking, and we are now nearing the end of volume 2 on willing. As I think most of you know, we are going to start volume 3. Well, we're going to start volume 3. We're going to read a series of texts that are thought to be and are in some ways a foundation for what volume 3 on judging would have been. And we'll start that February 11th. We're going to announce the schedule for that this week or early next week. And what we're going to do is read a series of texts. We'll read the lectures on her, on Kant's critique of judgment, which she gave at the New School. We'll also read 1 or 2 essays that she gave or wrote on the topic of judging, and maybe look at 1 or 2 unpublished texts that you can find on in her library, on the Library of Congress, in her archive. So we'll announce all that next week, but it'll be a chance for us to, in a sense, look at the foundation for the unwritten texts of what would have been volume 3 coming up. The main book, if you want to order the book, is Kant's. Yes, that's exactly right. Hannah Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy. We may also read a text called Thinking and Moral Considerations, which is in her book Responsibility and Judgment, posthumously published, edited by Jerome Cohn. And so I recommend those 2 books as the books we will be using. We're not starting until February 11th, so you have time to get them. Just want to make sure everybody is aware of those 2 books, and we will move on. So that said, we are now in the home stretch, in the conclusions part, section 4 of Life of the Mind, volume 2 on willing. And Arendt begins, so let's just remember what we've done, right? The whole book is about the problem of willing. She's interested, the whole section on the whole volume on willing is about the problem of willing, and willing is about freedom. It's about what does it mean to will, to want, to crave, to choose something. And the philosophers, we've been told, distrust will. They don't like will because it's not reason. And thus the distrust of will, she says at the very beginning, comes from thinking. Because the will is connected with freedom and thus is opposed to thinking, which is rational. And so will is this very, is in many ways the faculty opposed to thinking. And that's how she's presented it throughout the chapter on willing, is looking at the history of willing. And she says willing has a history. It's not, it wasn't talked about by a lot of people, but it begins largely with the Christian philosophers. And it begins with the Christian philosophers because, they're actually obsessed with this problem of the fact that the will doesn't follow reason and doesn't follow what God tells us. And the will is actually this sort of rebel faculty. And so they actually are the group, the Christian philosophers, that more than any other have explored the phenomena, the capacity of willing as distinct from thinking. Okay, we've gone through five or so Christian philosophers, finalized with Duns Scotus, and now we've been going fairly chronologically and going through the Christian fathers, and suddenly there's a big jump. We're going to jump from Duns Scotus in the 13th century to Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century. And that's a big jump. And Arendt says, I have to justify why I'm doing that, why I'm making such a huge leap across the centuries. And she says, well, there's one philosopher that I certainly don't, I have no apologies for not talking about because he's completely irrelevant here. And that's Kant. So she says about Kant, that Kant never imagined the will as a rebellious separate faculty of thinking. Why? Because for Kant, the will is simply a Vernunftwill, a rational will, and thus subordinate to thinking. It's simply, as she calls it on page 149, the executive organ of thinking. And so it's not the kind of independent faculty of freedom that the Christian philosophers imagined the will to be. And thus she says Kant really doesn't fit in the history of willing. And so we don't have any compunction about leaving him out. That's not the same that you can say about the German idealists, right? And this is what this chapter is about. It's called German Idealism and the Rainbow Bridge of Concepts. The German idealists, basically she's talking here about Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling as the three great exemplars of German idealism. And the German idealists do imagine the will as an important faculty. And Arendt says, nevertheless, I'm going to skip them. Now, of course, she doesn't skip them completely. She has a whole chapter on them, but she has a chapter on them as a group, not as she's done all these other thinkers where each thinker gets their own chapter. And she has a chapter on them as a group in order to explain why she's basically skipping them. The spoiler alert, right, is that she basically says, I'm skipping them because I don't like them. Now, that's not entirely true, of course. Arendt reads Hegel quite closely at times. Schelling and Fichte, not so much. We have to be honest, she's not so into them. But what is it that she doesn't like about them? She doesn't like about them something very simple, which is that they understand the will as a will to escape the world. They understand the will as a will to dream of a home in what she calls the rainbow bridge of concepts. And she says they are, here citing Nietzsche, they are marked by a homesickness, a desire to escape this world into another world, a world of idealism, and the idealists, and to escape reality. And as she says at the end of the chapter, she omits them because she doesn't believe in a world where we can be at home in concepts outside of the real world. As she says, I'm not homesick enough. It's important, I just want to point out that if you read literature on Hannah Arendt, there is probably no greater mistake amongst Arendtian scholars than to claim that Hannah Arendt was nostalgic for the Greeks, right? It's something you read over and over again. And it's shocking that so many people can say it because it's so completely not true. Arendt writes about the Greeks, and she thought the Greeks were really important, but there's no belief in her work that we should be going back to or have a nostalgia for the Greeks. She thinks the Greeks had things that were advantageous, they had things that were disadvantageous, but there's no thought in her work that we can go back there. She doesn't write out of a homesickness or nostalgia for the Greeks. And in fact, what she's saying here right now is she's going to skip the German idealists because they're too homesick for the Greeks. They're too homesick to go back to this world. And she doesn't want to do that, and she's not homesick enough. Her whole philosophy, as those of you know, is about amor mundi, the love of the world, the love of reality, the love of the world as it is. Her whole effort as a thinker is to say what is. Tote onta, as she quotes Herodotus. It's not about legein tai onta, to say what is. She's her whole effort is to not be homesick. She's a realist, and she thinks our world has been broken in many ways, and we have to own up to the brokenness of the world. But she's not a nostalgic thinker, and I think that's just for those of you who are Arendt scholars of any sort and read the Arendt literature, you'll see this claim made over and over again, and always be suspicious of it when you see it. All right, so this chapter proceeds, I guess, in 6 steps, or at least that's the 6 steps I've identified in it. She says that the idealists begin with what she calls the subjectivization of cognition and metaphysics. This is on page 150. It's through the German idealists that philosophy and thinking about the world places man at the center. Anthropomorphization, if you want to use the fancy word. Yes, the will for Paul and Augustine had always been about the interior man when he became a question for himself. But it's now the claim, right, that the whole world is to be seen through ideas as the expression of an idea. That's the whole premise of German idealism, is that all that happens in the world is a reconciliation of matter and spirit, and that what determines the world is actually spirit or ideas, that the world is an unfolding that comes out of an idea. And if you want to put it in a religious sense, it's obviously the thinking of God, the Deus Creatus. But in the philosophical sense, it's the philosophical God. It's the unfolding of being, or the idea, and that the world follows a rational, logical path. And so the idealists put man at the center, man as a thinker at the center. she then says that the sort of beginning of this is the rise of modern science. And this is an important insight. This is a reading of science she largely takes from both Nietzsche and Heidegger. But the premise here is that modern science has as its core insight that our senses deceive us. Our senses deceive us, error. And thus, what we learn from science is not that observation and experiments show us factually what is. What we learn from science is that all that we observe is suspect and subject to doubt, and it needs to be corrected by reasoning. She makes this point with incredible clarity in I think sections 33 and 34 of The Human Condition. The sections on Galileo and Descartes. But the basic idea here, and if you want to use Galileo as your example, as I like to do, when Galileo looked at the moon through a telescope, what he saw were dark and light spots. He then said, there are mountains on the moon. But he didn't see mountains. He saw dark and light spots. Well, how did he know there were mountains on the moon? Because he understood that the dark spots were the shadows where the mountains blocked the light of the sun, and the light spots were the mountains where the sun hit. And what Arendt says is what Galileo understood is that our senses need to be constantly corrected by our reason. That's what science is using reason to find the coherence in the incoherent facts that our senses give us. And so what Galileo, excuse the expression, it's the expression she uses. What Galileo understood is that science is, quote, a rape on our senses. It's that our senses are actually not trustworthy. And thus we have an incredible amount of doubt. And this doubt is then expressed in philosophy through René Descartes, right? Who doubted everything and then came to the conclusion that only thing he could know is that cogito me cogitare, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ego sum, I think therefore I am, and that this is a mental experience. But this doubt that Descartes introduced into the world is the third step, right? This horror of doubt, she says, will eventually lead to Nietzsche, but we don't get there yet. It's suspended, she says, the horror of this doubt by the optimism of scientific progress. We believe that even though we don't know anything, science will lead to some kind of nirvana, will bring us to the truth. But because we replace a kind of personal optimism with a kind of collective scientific optimism, and she says astronomy here is the ultimate science because it takes 100 years of people making observations, hoping that their observations will help future people make better observations and conclusions. That science operates not on the individual level, but on the level of mankind. That we will make progress as a species rather than progress as individuals. And so the doubt that Descartes and Galileo introduced into the world is ameliorated or mitigated by the prospect of progress as a scientific project. it is the German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel in Arendt's telling, that incorporate this scientific, optimistic project of progress into philosophy. The premise of the idealists is that since the world, the facts of the world are incoherent, the only way to bring progress and coherence to the world is to fit the whole world into a story, into ideas, and to see the world as a coherent unfolding of a simple story. So that freedom is what unfolds a history that is progressive, and it's to tell the history from the future. And so whether you're Hegelian and you think the whole world is the unfolding of the basic idea of being as freedom, or whether you're a Marxian and you think the whole world is a dialectical progression towards a communist utopia, or whether, you know, all of these ideas that are basically what she calls the German idealist school, see the future as the end point of philosophy and seek to, as Hegel did, tell the story of the whole of history in the world from the future. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at the dawning of the dusk. We can only tell a philosophy backwards from the perspective of the present, and the attempt is to make it coherent. And so it's an attempt to bring all of the history and incoherence of the world into a kind of coherent story. And that's what she thinks idealists like Hegel, Schelling, and Fichte do, as well as Marx, who she thinks is simply a German idealist inverted, who tries to tell that same story not from ideas but from a materialist history. As I said, this attempt to assert ideas over facts, over the incoherence of facts, over the incoherence of history, is anathema to Arendt. Her whole thinking is about accepting incoherence, accepting the sort of untold, mixed up, crazy thing that is history. And so she sees it as based in a kind of homesickness, an attempt to overcome reality through the rainbow bridge of concepts, the Hegelian reconciliation, the effort to make the what is rational, which is the fundamental Hegelian project, is really at the end what Arendt resists. Her claim that what we have to do is reconcile ourselves to the irreconcilability of Hegel is in many ways the actual central insight of so much of her work within the history of philosophy. And so she says we omit German idealism from our story, except in the sense of just telling you why we're admitting it, and because we're not homesick enough. And so that's how she ends chapter 13. We now enter the sort of last three thinkers of the will that she's going to talk about, the last two thinkers of the will, who are going to be Nietzsche and Heidegger. And obviously, this is getting closer and closer to Arendt's own approach to things. Obviously, she was a student of Heidegger's, and less important in this case, but a lover of Heidegger's. And I'm not in any way saying that she's a Heideggerian, because she's not. But she was certainly influenced by him, and Nietzsche is a profound influence on her work as well. The chapter on Nietzsche is called Nietzsche's Repudiation of the Will. Now, remember, the whole volume on willing starts with this idea that philosophers hate the will because the will is irrational and can't be controlled, and thus is against sort of the philosophical attempt to control the will. So now we have Nietzsche's repudiation of the will. On one level, Nietzsche is going to elevate the will, and on the other level, he's going to repudiate it. And so we have to understand how that works. Okay. The key here, we start on page 159 with her claim that Descartes' doubt, universal skepticism, as I said earlier, was held in check by the optimism of progress and science, and in philosophy by the idea that there was a progressive story or history to the unfolding of the world. And she says Nietzsche is going to obliterate that optimism and complete the doubt, which is going to lead to what he calls nihilism, the elevation of nothing. She says that there's a deep human desire, especially a scientific human desire, to predict the future. Any of us living in the 21st century know this so intimately, it has to hurt to hear her say this. The whole premise of so much of what goes by the name of social science in universities and in think tanks and in government is an attempt to make man predictable, to reduce humanity to a scientific data point and make man comprehensible so that we can collectively make policy decisions that will optimize some outcome. The latest and greatest expression of this desire to make man predictable is the rise of artificial intelligence. The idea that since man seems too impervious to predictability based on human calculations, the idea is that by using artificial intelligence, we can find patterns in human behavior that are predictable and controllable, so that we can actually lead to better policy directives to perfect human society even better. Obviously, Arendt's, so much of her work is directly opposed to this very idea of social science, the humans, which is another way of putting the human sciences. In German, they're called the Geisteswissenschaften, the sciences of the human spirit. And so much of her work is a rebellion against the effort to make man comprehensible and make humanity comprehensible, which is what the social sciences are about. Just a footnote, as many of you know, Heinrich Blücher, her husband, taught at Bard for many years, and it's because of him that at Bard we do not have a department of social sciences. We have the social studies, because he, along with Arendt, resisted the idea that the study of humans, Geisteswissenschaften, could be turned into a science. It should be something you study, but not something you know with certainty. Arendt says that Nietzsche is going to obliterate this optimism and complete the doubt. Already, way before him in the 17th century, John Donne, the poet, understood what science meant, and it's worth taking a look at the excerpt she cites here. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost in the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot. What done understood is that Descartes' philosophy, the new science, already had called everything into doubt and put the fire out, that everything was in pieces. This is part and parcel of Arendt's overarching view about the break in tradition, which she thinks begins with the rise of science and has its end point with the Holocaust, which she says simply was the real worldly manifestation of the utter nihilism that began with the rise of modern science. Okay, now we turn to Nietzsche himself, and the first thing to recognize is that the will is a two-in-one. Now, you'll all remember that her idea of thinking, as she expresses it earlier in this volume on thinking, is that thinking is a two-in-one in which we have a conversation or a dialogue with ourselves. Willing is a different kind of two-in-one. It's not a dialogue, it's a command. And insofar as the willing commands, it also assumes something or someone who obeys. And so when I will something, to drink my water, I will, and then I obey. And that this is a kind of duality. And yet we want to think of ourselves, well, that's okay, I don't want to say that exactly that way. We do think of ourselves not as obeyers when we will, but as commanders. We think of ourselves as willing to drink the water or willing to punch somebody, and we take joy in the fact that we can do what we will. We don't think about the fact that we're just obeying. And so she says there's an illusion or trick that we commit, in that we imagine that the superiority of ourselves as commander over ourselves as obeyer. And yet, in part of that joy is that we also feel the power in commanding over the part of ourselves that's obeying. And so that the very fact that we feel that joy, the joy comes from a power, shows that there is a resistance. There is someone who obeys within us. And so this is the two-in-one, that there's a pleasure in overcoming. And this pleasure is a kind of joy and hits a height of joy in abundance when we are able to overcome that whom obeys us. And there's a kind of life force in such willing, where I can feel the power of myself able to do such things. And thus there's this idea that life is most manifest when I will. So that willing is living, and living is overcoming, namely commanding over something that resists. So that life, Nietzsche says, is constantly about overcoming, and it's the will to power, something that, as Arendt rightly says, is not a name of a book that Nietzsche ever wrote, but is certainly an idea that is deeply important to his thinking, that will is power, and power is overcoming, and overcoming is what is life. She then addresses two metaphors for the will. One is Wille und Welle, will and wave. And I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but just as the wave constantly rises and falls and rises and falls, our wills, we have constant, I will for water, I will for ice cream, I will to punch people, I will to do this. Our will rises and falls, and there's a kind of joy in our actualization of our will over resistance. And one thing it's worth pointing out on page 165, where she quotes Nietzsche saying in the middle of the page, the will enjoys willing as the sea enjoy waves, for, quote, rather than not will, man even wills nothingness. This is an incredibly important insight of Nietzsche's. And the essence of it is that willing is life, right? As I said before, willing is power, willing is overcoming, willing is joy. And we as humans so profoundly need to will, because willing is life, right? That we would rather will nichts, nothing, than not will. And this is the core of Nietzsche's thinking about nihilism, right? We'd rather will that the world is meaningless than give up willing. Even when we destroy the world in its, even if we bring the world to an end through nuclear war or environmental disaster or whatever it is, we will do it joyfully, because we'd rather will than, and will nothing, will destruction of the world, than give up willing. So like the whole effort of environmental movement is, right, is trying to tell people, stop doing this, stop doing this, stop doing this, because it's going to lead to the end of the world. And what Nietzsche tells us is we'd rather will the end of the world than stop willing. It's an incredibly profound insight into the destructive nature of human willing. And you know, it's a minor part here, but she does bring it up, and it's one of the most important lines in all of Nietzsche's writing, and deeply meaningful and important. The second metaphor that she brings up, which is more important for her reading here, is the famous ewige Wiederkehr des Gleiches, the eternal return of the same. She presents one of the many versions of it in Nietzsche's writings on page 168. And this is, I think, from, if I'm not mistaken, from the unpublished notebooks, Das größte Schwergewicht, the greatest weight. And the basic idea of the eternal return, it's one of the more complicated ideas in all of Nietzsche, is that if someone comes to you and say that this life that you've lived is going to be lived eternally return as the same. Every pain, every joy, every thought, nothing different. Isn't this the worst thing that you could imagine? Because, you know, our lives are filled with misery and pain, and wouldn't it be boring to just live the same life over and over again? And wouldn't we want to change it? Because our will is to change it, to make it better, to progress. And the thought of the eternal return is to say yes to this idea, to will the world as it has happened in every detail to happen not only once again, but eternally, over and over again. And this thought, to will the world as it is, to love your fate, to embrace your fate as I would have it again and again and again and again and again, is for Nietzsche, on the one hand, born out of the impotence to change it. We can't change the world as it has been. And so either we have to resent the world and resent the pain and suffering and even the joys we have because we can't change it, or we have to love the world as it is, thus I willed it. And Nietzsche's highest thought, he says, is to will the world just as it is. But that takes away what? The will. the highest will, to will the world as it is, takes away the will, because it takes away the possibility of changing anything. It accepts fate. It's amor fati, to love fate, not amor mundi, which is Arendt's very different formulation and very much thought in opposition to Nietzsche. And this suggests that not only that the world, everything in the world is becoming, is not being. It's to, as Nietzsche once says, to stamp being on becoming, and to argue that the total value of the world cannot be evaluated. This is the willful, I mean, this is the paradox at the heart of Nietzsche, the willful repudiation of the will. The willful willing the world as it is, which takes away the power of the will to change it. And this is Nietzsche's the highest thought, and this repudiation of the will is what Heidegger is going to pick up on in his idea of the will not to will, but it's going to be in a different way. That'll be for next week's discussion. Okay, I realize now I've spoken for longer than I usually do. I apologize about that, but these are complicated passages. Nietzsche is, before I was an Arendtian, people called me a Leibnizian. Before I was a Leibnizian, people called me a Nietzschean. Most of my early publications were all on Nietzsche, precisely on these questions. So this is something that is 25 years old for me, but it's sort of the background from where I come out of. So always happy to talk about it. And I was a Heideggerian, I guess, somewhere in there. You know, yeah, we all move on in lives. I do wonder sometimes if I'm going to be an Arendtian the rest of my life. We'll see what happens. But that's where I am now. Complicated, fun, I hope interesting. I find this stuff really exciting. If you have questions, now's the time to ask them. You can go down to the little reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click on it and hit raise hand. I see 2 of you have done that. There's also I assume, an active chat. There usually it is. Please be respectful. It is a new year. Let's all start it off well. Good. Let's start. Who's first? Steve Greenleaf. You got to unmute, I think, Steve. Yeah.
There we go. Thanks, Roger. That was very interesting. Let me go back to one point that kind of struck me, and this is a somewhat familiar point, that of Arendt's dislike of social science and the predictability of behavior that she associates with the modern world. And it strikes me that, as I tend to think she does, she draws too tight a line. For a political decision maker, whether among the ancient Greeks at the time of, say, Thucydides, or a contemporary president, those political decision makers, political actors, have to make judgments about actions and policies to take that will form the future. And unless there is some predictability to those, to that reality in which they are operating, their decisions are no more than rolls of the dice, which they may be a great deal of the time, obviously. And it seems to me that in her ideas of social science, she's taking what I'll call a Newtonian view, that is of kind of predictability and pattern that Newton realized and brought into modern physics. But she seems to ignore, somewhat to my surprise, the insights that, and I displayed my ignorance here, but I perceive that quantum physics has about unpredictability and spontaneity. And that is that reality is this mixture of the predictable and the unique and contingent. And that as society has become more complex, and therefore in some ways more unpredictable, yet it also still maintains certain macro patterns that make predictability possible. So that, I guess as an undergraduate, I majored in history and political science, so I've had a foot in both backgrounds, and it seems to me they ought to be reconciled, whereas she seems to want to dismiss too quickly the social science aspect and the realities of human patterns throughout time.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So I think I think you've raised an important question. And this is actually the part of Arendt that I'm most interested in right now. So it's something I'm thinking a lot about. You say that decision makers, political decision makers, politicians, whatever we want to call them, need to make judgments about actions and policies, right? And that's true. The question is, how do they do that? That's one question. And to the extent they think there are scientifically correct answers to those problems, they're going to act potentially quite decisively and aggressively to actualize those correct answers. Arendt, is constantly reminding us of the folly of political thinkers and politicians who convince themselves that they know what is right to do. And she calls that kind of professionalization of politics, and the entry into politics of problem solvers and social scientists. She worries deeply that as more and more problem solvers enter government and government relies on problem solvers, they will fool themselves into thinking they know the right answer. Either, abortion is good or abortion is bad, or Star Wars is good or Star Wars is bad, or, quantitative easing is good or quantitative easing is bad. And they will act based on a kind of false security, false certainty. She thinks that statesmen have been fooled by this for generations, and she thinks we have to remember that it is folly to predict the future and to think that we can know what the right policy is going to be. That doesn't mean that we just don't act ever, but I think this is an important insight of Arendt's, or that some people are going to disagree with, right? And she is not a big believer that we should seek to solve social problems through collective action. Or let me put it this way, actually, that's not, she believes we should seek to solve social problems through collective action, but she believes that different groups and different people in different places should solve social problems through collective action differently in a plurality of ways that is not determined by or overwhelmed by a kind of scientific consensus, which she thinks will generally prove, at least on a social scientific level, prove to be fleeting. She's not anti-science, right, at all. I don't want you to think that's what I'm saying. but she is suspicious of social science in its ability to make accurate predictions about human behavior. In a way that, because she thinks that that denies the fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, which is to have freedom, to have a will, and to start things that are new. And so she is suspicious that to the extent that we bring social science into politics, she calls that a prejudice against politics, right? In her book, The Promise of, what's it called? The Promise of Politics, which I think we read about a year ago or a year and a half ago. She starts that essay, introduction into politics, by saying that we have a prejudice against politics. And the prejudice against politics, which is the same prejudice that we've been exploring in this volume against the will, is that the will and politics are irrational. And we seek to rationalize them through social science. And what she says is that's dangerous. It's not only dangerous, it's inhuman for her. It's anti-political. It denies human freedom, and it subordinates human freedom to sort of social science, which is always going to be an abstraction that denies individuality and uniqueness and tries to find coherent stories that tell us who we are, which always are going to be inadequate to who we really are. So the rise of problem solvers, technocrats, technocracy, bureaucracy, these are all anti-political movements, anti-freedom movements, anti-will movements that Arendt finds to be dangerous.
Well, I appreciate that. And I agree with her. As consumers of, say, social science, or for that matter, natural science, we should be skeptical, and purveyors of social science should be have a great deal of humility. And the other thing I would say is, again, I see her making too sharp a dichotomy between continuity and freedom, between the patterns of the past that are established and a future going off in new directions, the freedom, and that politics is this, as you may say, between past and future, that it is also between continuity and ingenuity or creativity. So that's so I'm very sympathetic to what she says. I guess my conclusion is she leaves me with the impression of too sharp a dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Just to be clear, she doesn't have the same worry about science as she has about social science. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be skeptical of, scientific claims. Of course we should. She does think, though, that the natural world is something that is rule bound and can be eventually understood because it's not free. But she thinks that the very effort of social science, which is to put free beings under rules, is contradictory and inhuman. Mm-hmm. Now, let me just be clear and back up. Obviously, there are many quote unquote social scientists who don't seek to reduce all human behavior to rules. And those are folks that I read with great pleasure and profit, as did she. I'm not saying all social scientists are wrong. I mean, that's not the point. But to the extent a social scientist seeks to reduce human behavior to modelable, predictable outcomes, she would think it's an inhuman social science. So I just want to make clear that there's plenty of good social science that doesn't do that.
Right.
And I'm not, and I And I find that social science to be incredibly valuable.
Right.
So I'm not trying to deny all social science. I just want to be clear about that.
Good point.
James Kyberd.
Happy New Year, Roger.
Happy New Year.
I'm making confessions. I spent the last 4 days reading these 2 chapters. I love them. They were so delicious. I got so excited about these chapters. Some of the things I read over and over again, I had to clean up myself after reading them. They were so amazing. And I cannot say that I understand a damn thing. However, and with Arendt, it sort of washes over me. It inspires me. My paintings and drawings have gotten outrageously good based on this Arendtian experience I'm having. I'm also looking for a tutor. If there's anybody in the group that feels they could hold my mangled hand to guide me through these days, I would so appreciate it, because I don't want to waste anybody's time. But this one sentence, these couple of sentences, the only redemption from this.
What page are we on? What page?
171. The only redemption from this all-devouring past is the thought that everything that passes returns. That is a cyclical time construct that makes being swing within itself. I start thinking John Coltrane and I'm gone. And then the other passages, the whole section on becoming does not aim at a final state, does not flow into being. Becoming is not merely an apparent state. Perhaps the world of beings is mere appearance. Becoming is of equal value at every moment. In other words, it has no value at all. For anything against which to measure, it is lacking. Whoa. I'll take a dozen to go. And I still don't know what I can't read the label. Any suggestions, Roger?
Well, look, this is, first of all, I always love hearing your reactions to this, James. So thank you. Happy New Year. Yeah, this is, I mean, look, these like 7 or 8 pages on Nietzsche. I mean, this is taking the highest summits of Nietzsche's thought and putting it into 7 pages of incredibly sparse, powerful commentary. And, you know, if you look, as someone who spent probably 7 years of my life reading these passages on Nietzsche, it makes some sense to me. But, you know, I can sympathize with your having your mind blown and yet not knowing which way it's been blown. So, you know, I tried in the opening to make some sense of it, but let me do a little bit more on some of this material. She starts the paragraph on 171 that you started with, saying, with the elimination of cause and effect, there is no longer any sense in the rectilinear structure of time, whose past is always understood as the cause of the present, whose present is the tense of intention and preparation of our projects for the future, and whose future is the outcome of both. So the elimination of cause and effect is that with the embrace of the eternal return of the same, right? We embrace not the world as we want it to be, but the world as it is.
Amen.
Amen. But therefore, we give up any intention to make the world one way or another, whether it's ours or even God's. The world simply is. And there's no cause behind it. There's no effect. And so at that point, the world doesn't change. And so the whole time structure of past, present, and future as a progressive structure disappears. It's just one revolving world without any change in it. And we will it because we will yes to the life and yes to that world. And in such a world, the time construct crumbles under the weight of the no less factual insight that everything passes, that the future brings only what will have been already, and thus we had no intention of it, and that everything that is deserves to pass away into the future. Nothing will be retained. And so, the only redemption, to jump down to where you read, from this all-devouring past, right, that there's no way to get out of it, is the thought that everything that passes returns, the eternal return of the same. That is a cyclical time construct that makes being swing within itself. There is that being is simply not prioritized. It goes, it disappears, it comes back, it disappears. It swings. And being, therefore, is becoming. It's never something that is privileged. Nietzsche has this great line: we must stamp being on becoming.
I like that.
So that all we can do is be in a constant swing, to use your, I think, helpful approach. And there's no intent on getting out of it or changing it. And we repeat this eternal sameness. We don't aim at any final state. And and this is, in that paragraph, the next paragraph, every philosophy and scientific hypothesis which necessitates such a final state is refuted. All progress is refuted by the eternal return of the same. Becoming must be explained without recourse to any final intentions. Becoming must appear justified at every moment. The present must absolutely not be justified by reference to a future, nor the past by reference to the present. And then we get these last few insights of Nietzsche that you read. The point is, what Nietzsche is here embracing is a will to life, a will to power, a will to joy, a will to overcoming that repudiates all willing, that embraces amor fati, the embrace of fate, the love of fate, and so embraces it that one can't get out of it, and one embraces and loves that. It's a stance that Nietzsche says almost no human being could embrace. He calls it a Superman, an Übermensch. We would have to overcome our profound human need to will and have intent and have meaning to become an Übermensch who could will not to will. That's the profundity of Nietzsche's insight. The Übermensch, that is translated as Superman or Overman, is the man who overcomes the human need to overcome.
Love it.
And in doing so, wills the eternal return of the same. And within the reflections on willing, this is, again, remember, it started with philosophers have rejected will because it's irrational and not in line with reason. Nietzsche's rejecting will in a willful rejection of the will, not a rational rejection of the will. He's rejecting will in the name of will.
Yes, I understand that.
He's rejecting will in the name of overcoming, in the name of joy and affirmation, not in the name of philosophy and reason. That's the incredible, profound jump from all previous philosophers into Nietzsche. It's the willful repudiation of willing. It's the life-affirming, non-rational, non-philosophical, willful repudiation of willing.
I got it. It feels like what I do now in my work, in my painting. I wait for the spirit to come. I grab two things with my hands and I make paintings. And I don't even know what I'm doing. It's just a total giving up to it. It's and that's why this section really flipped me out. Make sense?
Yeah, I'm just looking at, it just caught my eye that Steve Greenleaf said that this is a cop-out. And I'm not sure I understand the Krishna reference about why this is a cop-out, Steve. Maybe you can tell me why I'm a cop-out here.
I'm in the Bhagavad Gita, as Arjuna is lined up to go to war against his kin in the great battle. He says, I can't do this. I can't fight this battle. These are my kin. It's futile. It's worthless. It's horrible. And Krishna, and whatever guise he was in at the time, says, I'm paraphrasing here, suck it up and do your duty. This is your karma. You need to fight this battle. What will come of this battle is not in your control. You only have to do your duty. The fruits of your action are beyond your control, but you must act. You must do your duty. And I think that's the best advice, because, no matter how forcefully we will, we cannot control the future absolutely, though I would argue partially, depending on circumstances. And we know sure as heck, if we don't act, we will, we will suffer the consequences that we may not have had to have suffered if we had acted, okay? So there is no guarantee of success, but there's almost certainly a guarantee of failure. And so you do your duty as best you can discern. That's what I see as the contrast. What Nietzsche is kind of saying is, geez, we can't control the outcome. We can't will perfectly, ergo just will what is. And that's what I see as a bit of a cop-out. I mean, he seems very muscular at the beginning about will and talk of will to power, but in the end, he seems like, well, but he hedges his bets by his amor fati. And this is where I think he contrasts, well, I see him contrasting with Arendt, and I see him contrasting with Krishna's advice to Arjuna.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Nietzsche's not writing about how we should govern ourselves. He's not giving advice to the prince. It's a more philosophical approach here. He's talking, but what he is saying is that to live most, we have to will to repudiate our will. And now part of the reason he's saying that is that he's opposed to the idea that there is a kind of truth, and that in the name of truth we have to accept that there is no truth, and that truth has undone itself and killed itself by its own knives and own forces, and that reason as a impediment to will is always unjustified, and a restraint on life and a restraint on willing, and that we have to admit that the very truth of the rational world is that there is no truth and that everything is will, and that we have to destroy that world. This is a claim for destruction. Now, there are other parts of Nietzsche, right? And there are other readings of Nietzsche. But there's another part of Nietzsche, which is that in destroying the world, we open the possibility to build a new world with new truths that would not be seen as, which again would be truths we build, but would be truths that are meaningful today. And that's, what he calls building new tablets of laws and creating new tablets of laws. That's not the part Arendt's talking about here, but that's also part of Nietzsche. And so, while she's emphasizing the really strong nihilist reading of Nietzsche here, she would in other places articulate the other side. She's emphasizing it here because it is the way in the tradition of thinking about willing that she's talking about. This is where she thinks willing has gone in the modern age. And I think if you look at our world today, it's hard to deny that Nietzsche and she are right. You look at politicians today, what do they want above all around the world for the last 100 years? They want to tear the world down. I mean, that's so much of what our modern politics is, whether it's Hitler in one place or, Orban or Trump in another. There's a joy in destruction. There's a joy in tearing apart the institutions, which are seen to be corrupt, seen to be elitist, seen to be one-sided. And because the truth, the reason, the institutions, the norms are so obviously to people corrupt and not worth defending, their answer is a kind of willful destruction and joyful willful destruction. And Arendt sees that as the outcome in many ways of this 2,000-year history of willing. Yeah.
I mean, that's a good point, but aren't those patterns of destruction and creation always ebbing and flowing?
She is. Again, that's a great asked question, and she would say no. She thinks that she thinks the sort of nihilism is a modern phenomena that emerges post the scientific revolution, and really again entered the world with John Donne and Descartes, but was in a sense delayed in its impact by the idea of scientific progress and optimism, and that it's only with the failure, the perceived failure of the scientific project and the perceived failure of science and experts and technocrats to make the world better, that we're brought face to face with the full force of the destructiveness of willful nihilism that our modern world has to contend with.
Well, I will say your point is well taken, because as you were talking about that and earlier even, the fact that we recognize the anniversary of January 6th yesterday, I mean, that strikes me as an utterly nihilistic event.
Yeah.
In terms of the American political system. And these are folks who were hell-bent on tearing down with no concept of what to replace it with other than the wishes of the dear leader. But no, anyway, I'll leave it at that. It's a fascinating point.
Yeah. Just very quickly to Robert McKay's point that I'm just seeing popping up. I don't think Thrasymachus is a nihilist. I mean, Thrasymachus is attempting to be a realist. Big difference between a realist and a nihilist. Realist wants to accept the world, but not destroy it, not tear everything apart. I think a lot of the politicians we've confronted in the 20th century and now in the 21st century are utter nihilists. And I think that's a fundamentally different idea. Jen, I know you've had your hand up for a while. I'm sorry.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I have just a couple of different thoughts. I've really been enjoying everyone's comments today and this reading as well. One, as a social scientist myself, I wanted to place this a little bit in the history of social science, which in the 1960s and 70s, when she's working on this, there's a real turn in social science toward positivism, toward social science as a science that is attempting to find rules and laws for human behavior. And then there's sort of a backswing after this in the 1980s with calls against objectivity. And Donna Haraway is a feminist philosopher and a history of science studies writer who has a great line in one of her articles that there is no such thing as objectivity. Anything is the view from a body, always is structuring and structuring body. And so I think that there are elements to which Arendt and this is responding to social science of the 1960s and 70s, which was very positivist, and that the way that sociologists and anthropologists are trying to understand and study the world today is in some ways very different. But what I think that is really struck out to me in these passages was the way that she thinks about temporality and the way that she thinks about prior to even sort of like the French Revolution and these sort of major events, that there's less a focus on history and less a focus on futurity, more a focus on time repeating itself. And that now we're in this age where we really can see that things are changing over a long time scale and history becomes incredibly significant, as well as futurity. And I thought that this connected really in an interesting way where she talks about the temporality of willing and its inability to be retroactive on page 168, where she talks about we can't will backwards, but from that impotence, Nietzsche derives all human evil, resentment, the thirst for vengeance. We punish because we cannot undo what has been done, the thirst for power to dominate others. And this idea that people prefer looking backward because as you look through history, you can say, well, it had to have happened this way. It had to have unfolded this way. And so everything looking backwards appears to be necessary, whereas the future is this sort of unknown. And I thought that the sort of like this element that she's drawing from Nietzsche of the frustration with not being able to change the past and not being able to will retroactively, but trying to correct those wrongs by willing into the future. It has this really interesting sort of comment on the way that we experience and perceive timescales, the way that we try to right the wrongs that have happened to us in our personal lives, and as a society as well. And yeah, so I thought she sort of lays out what I think is an increasing conversation in a lot of different fields about the idea of progress and the sort of, we can often assume that progress is moving toward a naturally better world. The sort of famous Obama quote of the arc of justice is long, but the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And this question, does it, what is the outcome? And I think that, I don't know that there's an answer to that, but I think that this is something that she's trying to parse through in these sections, thinking about what does progress mean? Does it really exist? And what does it say about our ability to influence the future through our collective willing? So those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, there's a lot in what you said. First of all, on social science, as I tried to say, there's different kinds of social science. One of my mentors in undergrad, Austin Sarrett, co-wrote a piece that's been very influential in my life called "The Pull of the Policy Audience," and Austin Sarrett and Susan Silby. And the argument there is that to the extent that social science seeks to be relevant in policy, right, it has to make predictions, it has to make claims, and speak to a kind of offer positive policy suggestions, and that leads it to be more dehumanizing in the way we talk about. So obviously there's different kinds of social science, and I'm just talking about that. Arendt is worried about social science insofar as it makes claims about how to control human behavior and govern human behavior. On the question of, the book that I started many years ago and never wrote was on Nietzsche and revenge, right? And so this is stuff that I spent a long part of my life trying to think about. But the stone of the past is one of the great images in Nietzsche. It's that which we can't change it. Much as you'd like to, if yesterday you said something to your child or your wife or your husband that you wish you could pull back, you can't. And no matter how much you will it, you can't. And that inability to revise the past is the greatest sign of our impotence, of our lack of ability, lack of power to change things, that Nietzsche says. And it's out of that incredible feeling of impotence against the past that we build this enormous resentment that wants us to sort of hurt and punish and overcome, and that's what in the end leads to the repudiation of the will for Nietzsche. So I'll leave it at that for now, but it's an important point, and thank you, Jen. Robert, I know we're running out of time and I see a lot of questions. I apologize. I'm going to try and get through some of these. Robert, try and keep your questions short so I can get to some of these.
Sure. My general question is, how do we talk about the past or history without resorting to the Rainbow Bridge? It seems that, and I have a quote on 157. I'll read it really quickly, given the time.
157?
At the bottom of 157. It says, no doubt the personified concept had its root in verifiable experience, but the pseudo kingdom of disembodied spirits working behind men's backs was built out of homesickness. And then there's some more stuff after that. So I guess, if we're talking about, mankind as a personified subject that is subject to progress, can we just say the same thing that we've been saying throughout this talk, like nihilism or science? Aren't these personified concepts in a certain sense that help us explain history? And if they're Robert, not, what's to distinguish future?
Yeah, the easiest answer to that is, I don't know, were you in the group when we read her essay on Walter Benjamin in Men in Dark Times?
Maybe not.
Okay, but you might want to go back and look at that. The last section of that essay is on the pearl diver. And that's a way to do history and look at the past, not by forming coherent stories, but by finding pearls, wisdoms in history, and pulling them out and making them meaningful today, but not by trying to create a coherent single narrative history that explains everything. And so that's her alternative to your original question of how you do history that's not a rainbow bridge of concepts. Pulling out, pulling out a story. Someone tells you a story about Moby Dick and they focus on Pip, and you take that and you run with it, as Bill T. Jones did in his recent performance, and you make it into your own meaningful story. And that's the kind of pearl diving Arendt is talking about. And it's a very different approach to history.
Yeah, thanks for, I think, there seems to be a difference between like a univocity or univocal way of seeing history and an equivocity, but I'm still, I guess, not satisfied, and we can move on after this. whether an equivocity is sufficient for defeating the rainbow bridge. I think sometimes there's concepts that even if it is not consistent within a whole, like Hegel's spirit, it
Right.
still has some illusions, a part of it that
Yeah, and that's why
doesn't reconcile with the world.
and that's exactly what I was going to say is for Arendt, the whole premise of her idea of reconciliation is to recognize and focus on the irreconcilability of the world and not seek to reconcile it. And I think that's the, crux of her disagreement with the Rainbow Bridge.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Fran.
Hi. I think my question ties back to what you talked about with James and Steve. I also had a good time reading these last two chapters, and I had a little bit of feeling that I got something out of it, and I understood something, not much, but something. And then I spent the morning reading it, and in the evening I listened to President Biden's speech on the armed insurrection of the Capitol. And because I was thinking about the will, it stuck out to me that when he talked about the rioters, they weren't looking to uphold the will of the people. They were looking to deny the will of the people. They weren't looking to uphold fair and free election. They were looking to overturn one. So then I was very much confused how and in which way, first of all, why does he refer, when he talks about elections, to the will of the people? Because if it's true what you said, that philosophers are skeptical of the will because it's irrational, how can you measure it in an election? But then I thought maybe he uses it in the way that is more like you talked about Nietzsche. The joy or the force of life is being denied by other people who impose their will through violence. So I'm just like, I think my basic question is, how can I read philosophy and watch politics on the same day? How do I
love it.
How do I keep, yeah.
Yeah, that's a hell of a question, Fran. Yeah, in a sense, this is a question that this group has been grappling with for the last few years. To what extent are we reading a thinker? And do we take her as a thinker and think with her? And to what extent, and how do we then translate that into the world? And if the world is burning around us, do we keep reading a thinker or do we do something else? And what's the point of reading a thinker, right? This is a question of, especially last summer or summer ago, kept coming up in this group, right? To what extent is reading Hannah Arendt important in a nihilistic, racist, difficult time? And why do we do it? And I've tried to make this argument that it is important to keep thinking, and that we read her to think, and that I think doing so will help us think through politics, but not in any predictable ways. The will of the people is, I think, as you implied, suspect for many rational philosophers, because the will of the people can be racist, the will of the people can be fascist, the will of the people can be totalitarian. And so, we sort of valorize the will of the people in our democratic age. And yet many philosophers are terrified of the will of the people. And many politicians are terrified of the will of the people. And if the election had gone a different way, some people today might have a different view of the will of the people than they do, given where the election went. So yeah, I think it's an important, it's the will of the people, and again, if you look at the United States form of government, we don't have a direct democracy. And we don't, we weren't even imagined, we're much more democratic now than we were 200 years ago in both good and bad ways. More people can vote. That's a good way. But, we had all sorts of quote unquote protections from the will of the people built into our system of government. The Electoral College, the Senate was voted by state legislatures, not by the people. The idea was that we didn't trust the will of the people. The founders of this country certainly didn't. They wanted them to have some say, but they didn't want them to have the full say. And so this distrust of the will that afflicts philosophers is also, I think, is at the core of disagreements in many political arguments too. Do we really want the will of the people? Do we want a populist, plebiscitarian, or do we want the elites to, do we elect representatives who are supposed to be elite and hope that they will temper the will of the people? Right? I mean, that was part of the argument that Hamilton made. We don't want the people to rule. We want the elites to rule. That was a very big part of Hamilton's argument in the Federalist Papers. These are important questions in politics, and they mirror in some ways the suspicion of the will that Arendt attributes to philosophers. Now, Arendt aligns herself with the will insofar as she aligns herself with freedom, especially in the work of Duns Scotus and the idea of contingency. But then when we get to Nietzsche and Heidegger, what we're going to see is what happens to the will after the rise of modern science. And her answer is that with the rise of modern science and the loss of any kind of truth or moral worldview and the rise of absolute doubt, the will becomes an uncontrollable nihilist force that is not just about starting something new, but is about destroying all that is. And she thinks that in the modern world, the will has become, in a sense, unhinged or untethered, if I may, from not only from reason, but also from I now have to be a little bit more circumspect. That will has, in a sense, ceased to simply be the principle of newness and contingency, but has become a destructive force that seeks to tear down a no longer meaningful and vigorous way of life. And that's the danger that she sees in will, that she's going to develop in these last two chapters. You look totally perplexed, Fran.
Oh, Well, since you're speaking philosophically, so to say, I'm surprised that you're going with this phrase, the will of the people, because like, is there a collective will? Even like, have people thought about this, or like, is there a philosophy on the collective will, so to say? Can we take this as a given? I think like in the way that Biden used it yesterday, he equated it with elections. So that was like more like a one-to-one. But outside of this, in the way you're talking, I'm curious if this concept even exists.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't think there is a will of the people, no, but that's, we use it as it's a phrase in democracies. The will of the people is what the people decide, and majority rule is the way they decide it.
But do we have then to say, like, I'm speaking now philosophically, I'm speaking now politically? Do we have to make these distinctions, or is it okay to
No, I think you should. Yeah, I mean, I think you should. But we obviously fetishize the will of the people at an election in this country. Maybe in a way you're saying we shouldn't, but then why not overturn the will of the people? And, it's a complicated, you go down that road. If you're not going to fetishize it in some way, then it becomes, well, there's all sorts of ways we can figure out who won the election, and some of them are fair and some of them are less fair. But good. I need to go. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I'm sorry. There's still some questions hanging. Let's hopefully come back to them next time. For next week, just so you know, the reading is Martin Heidegger. If you thought Nietzsche was hard, James, etc., Heidegger is going to be harder.
I can't wait.
Roger, can I ask you something? Is it possible to split that chapter? There's a 15 and a 16. Right now, we're supposed to do both next week, and I wondered about doing 15 and then 16 because it's quite long.
I thought about that too, and I'm happy to do that. We have time to do it. So, is there a general yay or nay on this splitting?
Yay!
Anyone else? All right, let's do that. Maybe Tara, maybe you can change it on the schedule and tell Phil to let people know.
Yes.
Thank you, Tara.
So we'll split it and we'll just read chapter 15 for next week and 16 for the following week. All right. I need to run, but thank you all. Happy New Year. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week for chapter 15 on Martin Heidegger, Will Not to Will. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.